December 1985. West Allis, Wisconsin. The last Persian orange tractor rolls off the assembly line. A worker steps forward, reaches up, and tapes a handwritten sign across the hood. 4 words. The punchline of a cartoon pig. That's all, folks. The end. 4 decades earlier, this factory built the equipment that refined uranium for the first atomic bomb. Its turbines powered Hoover Dam. In the 1950s, this single company out-earned IBM. It was larger than 3M and Coca-Cola combined, larger than Johnson & Johnson and American Home Products put together. West Allis wasn't just where Allis-Chalmers operated. Allis was named after the company, an entire American city built around one industrial empire. By 1999, that empire would vanish. The factory would be bulldozed. The name would disappear from every storefront in Milwaukee. How does a company that helped win World War II, electrified the American West, and fed the American heartland, collapse in 7 years? To understand the fall, we have to go back to 1861, to a sheriff's auction, and to a 37-year-old tanner from New York who was about to make the most consequential bad investment of his life. Edward Phelps Allis was born in Cazenovia, New York, in 1824. Son of a merchant, graduate of Union College, he should have become a lawyer or a banker. Instead, at 22, he packed his bags and followed a college roommate west to a muddy port town on the shore of Lake Michigan called Milwaukee. It was 1846. Milwaukee had barely 20,000 residents. The streets were dirt. The waterfront smelled of fish and sawdust. But the city was booming. German and Irish immigrants poured in by the thousands. The lumber mills ran day and night, and the wheat fields of Wisconsin stretched west beyond the horizon. Allis and his roommate opened a leather tanning operation. It made money. Enough money that by 1861, Edward P. Allis had cash in the bank and a reputation as a shrewd businessman. That was the year everything changed. 14 years earlier, in 1847, 2 millwrights named James Seville and Charles Decker had opened a small machine shop on West Water Street, now North Plankinton Avenue. They called it the Reliance Works. They made milling equipment for flour mills and sawmills, and for a while, they did well. Then came the panic of 1857. The lumber industry collapsed. Flour prices cratered. The Reliance Works couldn't pay its bills. By 1861, the company was bankrupt, its machinery headed for a sheriff's auction. Edward P. Allis showed up at that auction with a tanner's money and an industrialist's eye. He bought the Reliance Works outright. He renamed it Edward P. Allis and Company. He had no training in metalworking. He'd never built a steam engine. He knew nothing about foundry work. What he had was capital and the willingness to hire better men than himself. In 1867, he moved the company to a larger site in Walker's Point to begin manufacturing steam-powered machinery. The timing was perfect. Across America, sawmills and flour mills were abandoning water wheels for steam engines. Allis was there to sell them. Then came 1871. Milwaukee's city leaders needed a new water system, a 21 million-gallon reservoir, pumping stations, and miles of cast-iron pipe. They awarded Allis the contract, 2,600 tons of pipe. To fulfill it, he built a $100,000 pipe foundry, the first in the city. It nearly destroyed him. The panic of 1873 hit just as the foundry came online. Credit dried up. Orders evaporated. By the end of the year, Edward P. Allis and Company was insolvent. But Allis did something extraordinary. He negotiated with his creditors, kept the company intact, and emerged 2 years later still in control. And then he made the decision that defined everything that came after. Edward P. Allis understood he was not an engineer. so he hired the best engineers in America. In 1873, he brought in George Hinckley, a sawmill specialist. Hinckley perfected the commercial bandsaw, transforming the lumber industry of the Pacific Northwest. Every board foot cut in Washington and Oregon in the 1880s bore the invisible signature of an Allis machine. Then Allis hired Edwin Reynolds, a steam engine designer whose name meant reverence in industrial circles. Reynolds came from the Corliss Steam Engine Company, one of the most celebrated builders in the world. Under his direction, Allis began producing engines of staggering size. By the 1880s, the company built blast furnace blowers 40 feet tall, rolling mill engines with flywheels weighing 53 tons, machines so large they could barely be transported by rail. By the end of the decade, Edward P. Allis and Company was the largest steam engine manufacturer in the United States, possibly the largest in the world. And then, on April 1st, 1889, Edward Phelps Allis died. He was 64. He left behind a company with a global reputation, more than 1,000 employees, and one of the most valuable industrial names in the American Midwest. Edwin Reynolds took over the leadership and began planning the company's modernization. But no one at Walker's Point yet understood what was coming. 12 years after Allis's death, his company would cease to exist. Not because it failed, because it was about to be absorbed into a merger so vast, so ambitious, it would create a new kind of American industrial giant and build an entire city in the process. The turn of the 20th century was the age of the merger. John D. Rockefeller had consolidated American oil. Andrew Carnegie was about to sell his steel empire to J.P. Morgan for $480 million, the largest business transaction in human history up to that point. Across the United States, industrialists were no longer satisfied with being the largest company in their city, or their state, or their region. They wanted to dominate entire industries, nationally, globally. Edwin Reynolds, the engineer now running Edward P. Allis and Company, believed his company could control the industrial engine business of America. He just needed to get bigger, much bigger. In May of 1901, the deal closed. 4 companies merged. The Edward P. Allis Company of Milwaukee, already the world's largest builder of steam engines. Fraser and Chalmers of Chicago, world famous for mining machinery. Their equipment powered the Anaconda Copper Company in Montana and the Homestake Mining Company in South Dakota. The Gates Iron Works, also of Chicago, whose Gates gyratory crusher had become standard equipment in cement plants around the world. And the industrial engine business of the Dixon Manufacturing Company of Scranton, Pennsylvania, makers of blowing engines, compressors, and some of the finest plate shops in the East. The merged entity took the name Allis-Chalmers Company. Charles Allis, Edward's son, became the first president. Edwin Reynolds stayed on as chief engineer. The headquarters remained in Milwaukee, but the old Reliance Works on Walker's Point was now too small. Far too small. In 1902, Allis-Chalmers broke ground on a new plant west of the city, on 160 acres of open farmland. They called it the West Allis Works. It was a vision of industrial modernity. Most factories of the era had grown up haphazardly, buildings added as needed, production lines twisting through mismatched sheds. West Allis was designed from blueprint to finished machine to flow in a single direction. Raw iron came in one end. Finished industrial equipment rolled out the other. 21 miles of railroad track crisscrossed the site. 5 miles of internal roads. Over 4 million square feet of floor space. The plant was engineered to employ 10,000 men. The village that grew up around it needed a name. The workers lived in boarding houses, and new brick bungalows clustered along the plant's perimeter. By 1902, they'd organized themselves as a village. By 1906, the village had become a city. They called themselves West Allis, an entire American city, incorporated and named after a single manufacturing company. 2 years later, in 1904, Allis-Chalmers reached further. They acquired the Bullock Electric Manufacturing Company of Cincinnati, Ohio, a leading producer of generators, motors, and transformers. Overnight, the company added electricity to its portfolio. That same year, Allis-Chalmers signed a licensing agreement with a Swiss firm called Escher, Wyss and Company of Zurich, founded in 1805, nearly a century before Allis-Chalmers existed. Escher Wyss was the world's leading designer of hydraulic turbines. Now their designs would be built in Milwaukee. The company had arrived, and it had a slogan to match. Ours the four powers: steam, gas, water, electricity. No American manufacturer could claim that range. General Electric did electricity. Westinghouse did electricity. Corliss did steam. But only Allis-Chalmers did all four and built the machines that filled mines, mills, sawmills, flour mills, power plants, and factories across the country. By February 1916, the West Allis Works employed 5,500 workers alone. The full corporate workforce had grown to 8,300. Allis-Chalmers was one of the 100 largest manufacturers in the United States. And yet, beneath the confident slogans, beneath the marble lobby of the new headquarters, the company was in trouble. The merger had been too fast. 4 companies, 4 cultures, 4 sets of managers, 4 sets of customers. The debt taken on to finance the West Allis Works was crushing. The economy wavered. Production quality suffered. Orders slowed. By 1912, Allis-Chalmers was placed into receivership. The great industrial combine, barely a decade old, was bankrupt. The receivers reorganized the company as the Allis-Chalmers Manufacturing Company. But reorganization was only paper. The company needed a leader, someone who could impose discipline on a sprawling, fractured, unprofitable giant, someone who knew how to command. They found him in 1916. He wasn't an engineer. He wasn't a financier. He was a retired brigadier general of the Wisconsin National Guard. And under his command, Allis-Chalmers would enter a business that would save it and nearly define the American 20th century. His name was Otto Hermann Falk. He was 51 years old when he took over Allis-Chalmers in April of 1916. He stood straight as a flagpole, spoke like a man issuing orders, and had never worked a day in the civilian machinery business. By every conventional measure, he was the wrong man for the job. Falk was born in Milwaukee in 1865, the son of a German immigrant foundryman. He graduated from the Allen Military Academy in Chicago in 1884 and spent the next 27 years in uniform. He rose through the Wisconsin National Guard from lieutenant to brigadier general. He retired from active military service in 1911 and took up a vice presidency at the Falk Corporation, his family's steel foundry just across the Menomonee Valley from West Allis. When the Allis-Chalmers receivers came looking for a leader in 1916, they wanted a man who could impose order on chaos. A man who could walk into a factory of 8,000 men and be obeyed. They found him in Otto Falk. He took command like an officer taking a hill. Falk cut dead product lines. He closed unprofitable subsidiaries. He installed new accounting systems. He demanded that every division justify its existence with profit. And then, against the advice of nearly every senior manager around him, he bet the company's future on an industry it had never touched. Farm machinery. In 1914, 2 years before Falk's arrival, Allis-Chalmers had quietly built its first tractor, the Model 1018. It was a commercial disappointment. The machine was underpowered, overweight, and expensive. American farmers in 1914 still plowed with horses. and the handful who bought tractors bought them from Henry Ford or International Harvester, companies that had been in agriculture for decades. Falk looked at the 10 to 18 and saw something his managers did not. He saw the transformation coming to the American countryside. He saw the gasoline engine displacing the horse. He saw a nation of 6 million farms that would, within a generation, need to be mechanized. One farm, one tractor, one harvest at a time. Between 1914 and 1919, Allis-Chalmers expanded the tractor line. The Model 612, the Model 1530. The implement division grew. Dealerships opened across the Midwest. The machines improved, but they still didn't sell. Then came the Great War. On April 6, 1917, the United States entered the First World War. Allis-Chalmers shifted overnight into military production. They built marine engines for destroyers and cargo ships, gun mounts for the U.S. Navy, shell casings for the artillery batteries of the American Expeditionary Forces in France, electrical equipment for the factories that made every other weapon of the war. President Franklin Roosevelt would later coin the phrase "arsenal of democracy" in 1941 during the Second World War. But the pattern had been established 24 years earlier. Allis-Chalmers was already that arsenal. By the end of 1918, the company was profitable. Debt was falling. The West Allis works hummed 24 hours a day, but the tractor business still lost money. Through the roaring 20s, as American industry boomed and Model T Fords rolled off Detroit assembly lines, Allis-Chalmers kept pouring capital into its agricultural division. The Model 1830, the Model 1220, the Model 1525, all competent machines. None of them winners. By 1926, 10 years into Otto Falk's command, the tractor division was still underperforming. The board was restless. Some wanted to sell it off entirely. Others wanted to liquidate it. Falk did neither. Instead, he made a phone call to a man selling tractors for a rival company in Peoria, Illinois. A man named Harry Merritt. Harry Merritt was a salesman. He had worked the floors and the farm fields of half a dozen machinery companies. Most recently, he'd been at Holt Manufacturing, the California tractor maker that would soon merge with Best to form Caterpillar. Merritt knew farmers. He knew dealers. He knew the difference between a tractor that looked good in a brochure and a tractor that could pull a plow through Iowa clay in August. In 1926, Otto Falk hired him away from Holt and handed him the Allis-Chalmers tractor division. Some said Falk brought Merritt to Milwaukee to shut the tractor business down. Others said he brought him in to save it. Even if the first was true, the second is what happened. Merritt walked through the West Allis tractor line in his first week and rewrote it. He demanded better engines. He demanded simpler controls. He demanded machines a farmer could repair himself with a wrench and a hammer. And then he demanded something no one at Allis-Chalmers had thought to care about. He demanded color. In 1929, Merritt decreed that every Allis-Chalmers tractor, from that moment forward, would be painted a single, unmistakable color, a deep, burning orange. Company lore later traced the inspiration to a field of California poppies Merritt had spotted from a highway, ablaze against the dry grass. Whether the poppy story was true or simply marketing mythology, the color itself was a stroke of genius. They called it Persian orange. John Deere painted its tractors green and yellow. International Harvester painted them red. Farmall painted them red. Ford painted them gray. In a crowded dealer lot, an Allis-Chalmers tractor in Persian orange stood out like a flare in the dark. On a rural highway, drivers could spot an Allis-Chalmers from a distance no competitor could match. Sales climbed. Then came the Model U in 1929, the first farm tractor in America equipped with low-pressure rubber tires, developed in cooperation with Firestone. Until that year, every tractor in America rode on steel lugs, that tore up roads and shook a driver's teeth loose. Rubber tires were faster, gentler, and safer. The Model U redefined the industry. In 1926, the same year he hired Merritt, Falk also acquired Nordyke Marmon and Company of Indianapolis, a maker of flour milling equipment. It fit the old Alice tradition. But the future was on Merritt's side of the business. From nearly nothing in 1927, agricultural equipment grew to just under 60% of Allis-Chalmers' total corporate sales by the late 1930s. The tractor division, once an embarrassment, had become the profit center of the entire company. In 1937, Allis-Chalmers released the Model B. It was small. It was cheap. It was designed for the family farm, the quarter-section homestead, the dairy operation, the tobacco patch. Most American farmers in the 1930s still couldn't afford a tractor. The Model B changed that. At just $495, it put mechanization within reach of the small farmer. The Model B stayed in production for 20 years. It became one of the most beloved farm machines in American history. A generation of farm children learned to drive on a Persian orange Model B. While Merritt was winning the farm, the company was winning elsewhere. In the late 1930s, the Public Works Administration ordered 7 hydraulic turbines from Allis-Chalmers to power the new Hoover Dam on the Colorado River. When the dam came online in 1936 and electrified the American Southwest, the water spinning those turbines passed through blades designed and built in Milwaukee. Otto Falk had taken a bankrupt conglomerate and rebuilt it into one of the most diversified industrial empires in the United States. Steam engines, mining machinery, flour mills, hydroelectric turbines, electric motors, and now a river of Persian orange tractors flowing out of West Allis onto every dirt road in rural America. In April of 1940, Otto H. Falk died. He was 74. He had led Allis-Chalmers for 24 years. When he took command in 1916, the company was bankrupt. When he died, it employed more than 20,000 people and supplied machinery to 5 continents. Falk did not live to see what came next. He didn't see his factory taken over by the United States government. He didn't see his workers building weapons around the clock. He didn't know that, in a locked corner of the West Allis Works, a small team of engineers was about to be assigned the most secret industrial contract in American history. A contract that would help end a world war and bring mankind into the age of the atom. On December 7th, 1941, Japanese torpedo bombers struck the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. By the end of the week, the United States was at war with Japan, Germany, and Italy. In West Allis, Wisconsin, the factory gates stayed open around the clock. Allis-Chalmers had been ramping up military production since 1939, when President Roosevelt declared a national emergency and began rebuilding a defense industry that had atrophied during the interwar years. By Pearl Harbor, the West Allis Works was already a war plant. After Pearl Harbor, it became something else entirely. Employment climbed from roughly 15,000 before the war to more than 20,000 at peak, the highest headcount in the company's history. Women poured into the machine shops for the first time. African-American workers arrived from the South in the Great Migration. The cafeteria at West Allis served tens of thousands of meals a day. The parking lots overflowed. Shifts ran 24 hours. The product list was staggering. Allis-Chalmers built marine engines and propulsion machinery for hundreds of U.S. Navy vessels, destroyers, submarines, cargo ships, landing craft. Every ship that carried American soldiers to Normandy on June 6, 1944, carried machinery from Milwaukee. The company built gun mounts and fire control systems, aircraft engine components, shell casings by the millions, electric motors for every kind of military equipment, tracked vehicles for the Army ground forces. The phrase "arsenal of democracy" had entered the American lexicon through a Roosevelt address to Congress on January 6, 1941. By 1942, the phrase applied to dozens of major industrial plants across the country. Ford at Willow Run, Boeing in Seattle, Kaiser in Richmond, and Allis-Chalmers in West Allis. But in a locked section of the plant, behind doors that required special clearance, a smaller group of engineers was working on something none of them fully understood. The contract came through the Manhattan Engineer District, the code name for the project to build the first atomic bomb. Allis-Chalmers was asked to produce uranium processing equipment and specialized research machinery. The components were manufactured to tolerances the company had rarely faced. They were crated, sealed, and shipped, some to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where enormous facilities were separating fissile uranium-235 from the more common uranium-238. Some to Hanford, Washington, where plutonium was being produced in the world's first industrial-scale reactors. Some to Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the weapons themselves were being designed by Robert Oppenheimer's team. The workers at West Allis did not know where the crates were going. They did not know what their machines would do. They were told only that the work was essential, that it was classified, and that they were not to discuss it with anyone, not their wives, not their neighbors, not in the bars along South 71st Street. On August 6, 1945, an American B-29 named Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second bomb, a plutonium device, fell on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. Only then did the workers of West Allis begin to suspect what they had helped to build. The war ended. The contracts ended. Allis-Chalmers had manufactured weapons for 4 years. Now it would have to return to selling tractors, turbines, and mining equipment to a peacetime economy. But the company that emerged from the war was not the company that had entered it. 20,000 workers had organized themselves into one of the most powerful unions in the state of Wisconsin, and their leader had been preparing for this moment since 1937. His name was Harold Robert Christoffel. He had been born in Milwaukee in 1912, the son of Swiss immigrants. He apprenticed as an electrician at Allis-Chalmers in the late 1920s, just out of his teenage years. He worked the shop floor. He read. He studied union organizing. And in 1937, at the age of 25, he founded United Auto Workers Local 248 at the West Allis plant. Within a few years, Local 248 was the largest local union in the state of Wisconsin. It led strikes in 1939 and again in 1941, the infamous defense strike that lasted 76 days, from January 22nd to April 7th, while the United States prepared for war. Washington watched with alarm. Generators and propulsion machinery for U.S. Navy vessels were piling up unfinished. President Roosevelt considered seizing the plant. Christoffel entered the U.S. Army in 1944. Local 248 was taken over by his lieutenant, Robert Buse. But Christoffel would return. And when he did, the conflict between Allis-Chalmers management and the union that represented its workers was going to explode. It would last 11 months. It would become one of the longest and bitterest strikes in American industrial history. It would end union power at Allis-Chalmers. And it would help rewrite American labor law for the next 80 years. Harold Christoffel came home from the Army in 1945. He walked back into the local 248 Union Hall on South 71st Street and found his union waiting for him. The workforce at West Allis was not the workforce he had left. 20,000 men and women had built the machinery that beat Hitler and Hirohito. Many had served overseas. Many had sent sons who never came home. They had worked 7 days a week, rotating shifts, under wartime discipline for 4 years. Now, the war was over, and they wanted their share. Across America in 1946, the post-war strike wave was already rolling. Steelworkers walked out. Auto workers walked out. Railroad workers walked out. Electrical workers walked out. More than 4 million Americans struck in the single year of 1946, the largest labor uprising in the history of the United States. At Allis-Chalmers, the flashpoint was not wages. It was the maintenance of membership agreement, a provision that required workers at the plant to stay in the union once they joined. The union had won it from the National War Labor Board in 1943. In early 1946, Allis-Chalmers management announced it was unilaterally withdrawing the provision. To Local 248, it was an attack on the union's survival. On April 29, 1946, 8,000 Allis-Chalmers workers in Milwaukee voted overwhelmingly to walk off the job. Across the country, nearly 12,000 production and maintenance workers at Allis-Chalmers plants joined them. Robert Buse, the Local 248 president, told the press that wages were not the issue. Unresolved grievances from the war years were the issue. Union security was the issue. The closed shop was the issue. The picket lines went up at the gates of West Allis. Thousands of workers marched in shifts around the chain-link fence. Milwaukee CIO locals sent members to reinforce the line. Donations flowed in from unions across the Midwest. Through the summer of 1946, the strike held. The smaller Allis-Chalmers plants in other states gradually returned to work. But Milwaukee stood firm. The West Allis plant, the heart of the company, produced nothing. Then the attacks began. Police clashed with strikers at the plant gates. Pickets were beaten. Demonstrators from other Milwaukee CIO unions arrived to support Local 248 and were brutalized and arrested by Milwaukee police. The local newspapers, the Milwaukee Journal and the Milwaukee Sentinel, began running stories questioning the loyalty of the union's leadership. The word appeared in print. Then again. Then in every article. Communist. Harold Christoffel had been a radical since his 20s. He had associated with members of the Communist Party. So had other Local 248 leaders. In the 1930s, that was not unusual in American industrial unionism. Communists had been among the most effective organizers of the CIO era, and the distinction between radical union politics and party membership was often blurred. But 1946 was not the 1930s. The war was over. The Soviet Union was no longer an ally. A new fear was rising in Washington, and the United States Congress was about to come to Milwaukee. In the fall of 1946, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, HUAC, arrived in Wisconsin. They came to investigate the Allis-Chalmers strike. They came to interrogate its leaders. They came, above all, to find communists. Harold Christoffel was called to testify. So were other Local 248 officers. The company launched a vigorous back-to-work campaign, publishing full-page newspaper advertisements urging workers to cross the picket line and return to their jobs. The newspapers echoed the message. Radio stations echoed the message. Civic groups and churches echoed the message. Red baiting became a daily feature of Milwaukee life. Every story about the strike was a story about communism. Every union leader was a potential subversive. Every picket was a potential saboteur. The strike began to fracture. Workers with families to feed, mortgages to pay, and children to clothe started drifting back through the gates. By February of 1947, the line was thinning. By March, it was broken. On March 23, 1947, after 11 months on the picket line, Local 248 called the strike off. There was no contract. There were no wage increases. There were no grievance settlements. The maintenance of membership provision was gone. and 91 Union leaders, including much of local 248's officer corps, were fired. The next year brought the final blow. In 1948, Harold Christoffel was indicted for perjury, accused of lying under oath in his HUAC testimony about his connections to the Communist Party. He was convicted. He became the first American labor leader indicted and jailed in the post-war Red Scare. But the damage extended far beyond one union, one company, one city. While the Allis-Chalmers strike was still underway, the United States Congress had been drafting sweeping new labor legislation. Company officials played a significant role in shaping that legislation, feeding lawmakers data and testimony from the ongoing Milwaukee conflict. The bill became the Taft-Hartley Act. President Truman vetoed it. Congress overrode the veto. On June 23, 1947, it became law. Taft-Hartley banned the closed shop. It outlawed secondary boycotts. It authorized states to pass right-to-work laws that would hollow out union membership across the South and the Sun Belt for generations to come. It required union officers to sign affidavits swearing they were not communists. Allis-Chalmers, as a company, had won the longest industrial strike of the post-war era. It had broken the militant leadership of Local 248. It had helped shape federal labor law for the rest of the 20th century. But the workers at West Allis remembered. Generations of fathers passed the story down to sons. The men and women who walked that picket line in the winter of 1946 and 1947, who stood in the snow outside the gates of the plant that built them their homes and their pensions and their lives, did not forget what the company had done or what it was capable of doing again. And yet, in the boardroom at Allis-Chalmers headquarters, the mood was triumphant. The union was broken. The war was won. The economy was roaring. American manufacturing was the envy of the world. The next 15 years would be the greatest in the company's history. By the early 1950s, Allis-Chalmers would employ more than 30,000 workers. It would earn more revenue than IBM. It would stand among the largest industrial corporations on our earth. But buried inside that prosperity, invisible, unmentioned, growing quietly on source science, were the seeds of its destruction. In the early 1950s, if you had drawn a map of industrial power in the United States, one of the brightest dots on that map would have been a Milwaukee suburb called West Allis. Allis-Chalmers was among the 100 largest manufacturers in America. More than 30,000 employees drew paychecks from the company. Its annual revenue exceeded that of International Business Machines, the company that was already becoming synonymous with the future of computing. Allis-Chalmers out-earned American Home Products and Johnson & Johnson combined. It was larger than 3M and Coca-Cola, added together. And yet, outside of the Midwest, most Americans had never heard of it. That was because Allis-Chalmers sold to other businesses, not to consumers. The average American never bought an Allis-Chalmers product in a store. But the electricity that lit their kitchens, the flour that baked their bread, the concrete that paved their streets, and the grain that filled their supermarkets, all of it passed through machinery built in West Allis. The product catalog was almost absurd in its range. In agriculture, Allis-Chalmers released the Model WD-45 in 1953, the first of its tractors to offer diesel power and factory power steering. At 39 horsepower, it was the strongest tractor the company had ever built. Farmers lined up to order them. The WD-45 became one of the most beloved machines in American farming history. 4 years later, in 1957, came the D-17, bigger still, more powerful, more refined. The D-Series defined the American farm tractor for a decade. The Persian orange machines rolled out of West Allis by the tens of thousands. In construction equipment, Allis-Chalmers built crawler tractors that reshaped highway projects across the country. The HD-5, produced from 1946 through 1955, sold nearly 30,000 units. Later came the HD-6, the HD-11, and eventually the monstrous HD-41, unveiled in 1970, a 65-ton dozer powered by a 524-horsepower Cummins 5th 12, blades up to 22 feet wide, built for strip mining operations, including the Savannah River Nuclear Facility in South Carolina. In power generation, the company built steam turbines and hydraulic turbines on a scale that filled entire dam powerhouses. Allis-Chalmers turbines spun in hydroelectric plants across the Tennessee Valley, the Pacific Northwest, and the Colorado River Basin. Their engineers refined the licensed Escher-Wyss designs from half a century earlier into some of the most efficient turbines in the world. Then, after World War II, Allis-Chalmers entered the nuclear power industry. The company built research reactors, pumps, and pressure vessels for the first generation of American civilian nuclear power plants. By the late 1950s, a tractor company from Milwaukee was helping light American cities with atomic energy. In 1959, an engineer named Harry Ehrig and a small team at Allis-Chalmers built something that had never existed before. They mounted a 15-kilowatt hydrogen fuel cell onto the chassis of an Allis-Chalmers tractor. It ran. It worked. It pulled a plow. The electrolyte was potassium hydroxide. The power came from hydrogen and oxygen reacting across catalytic membranes, and the exhaust was pure water. It was the world's first fuel cell-powered vehicle. Ehrig's tractor toured state fairs across the country. Farmers stared at it. Reporters photographed it. The demonstration unit eventually went to the Smithsonian, where it remains today, a quiet relic of a moment when an Allis-Chalmers engineering team built a technology that the rest of the automotive industry would not seriously pursue for another 40 years. On the face of it, the company had never been stronger. But the numbers told a more complicated story. Allis-Chalmers competed in many industries. It dominated none of them. In farm equipment, the kings were John Deere and International Harvester. They were bigger. They had more dealers. They spent more on research. They out-advertised Allis-Chalmers in every farm magazine in America. In power generation, the giants were General Electric and Westinghouse. They had the utility contracts locked up. They had the engineering staffs. They had the political connections in Washington that mattered when a dam got funded or a nuclear plant got licensed. In construction equipment, the leader was Caterpillar, the Peoria company that had absorbed the old Holt business Harry Merritt had once worked for. Caterpillar dominated heavy earth-moving the way John Deere dominated farms. Allis-Chalmers was second or third or fourth in every market it served. It survived on the combined strength of its many divisions, not on dominance in any single one. That was the hidden vulnerability. As long as the American economy was expanding, as long as every industry was growing, Allis-Chalmers could ride the rising tide. A contraction in one division could be offset by expansion in another. But if all the divisions contracted at once, if mining, farming, construction, and power generation all fell together, the company had nothing to fall back on. The 1950s and 1960s were not the decades to discover that flaw. The economy roared. The Cold War poured defense dollars into every American industrial sector. The interstate highway system, authorized in 1956, created a generation of construction contracts. The Rural Electrification Administration kept demanding more turbines. The baby boom kept demanding more food, more houses, more of everything. Allis-Chalmers prospered. The dividends flowed. The shareholders smiled. The next decade would be the last one in which any of that was still true. In 1971, Allis-Chalmers reorganized itself. The old Allis-Chalmers Manufacturing Company, the name adopted in 1912, back when Otto Falk was still organizing his first receivership, became the Allis-Chalmers Corporation. The change reflected the new reality. The company was no longer a single American manufacturer. It was a global conglomerate with subsidiaries on 4 continents, joint ventures in Europe, licensing agreements in Japan, and assembly plants in South America. On paper, the empire had never been larger. In practice, it had never been harder to manage. The 1970s began with optimism. American farming was entering a boom unlike anything since World War I. The Soviet Union, struggling with its own agricultural failures, negotiated a multi-year contract for American wheat and feed grains in 1972. Richard Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz, looked at the exploding demand and gave American farmers a directive that would echo for the next decade. Plant fence row to fence row. Get big or get out. Farmers listened. They bought more land. They took out bigger loans. And they bought bigger tractors. The farm equipment industry entered a golden age. From 1976 through 1979, demand for American-made agricultural machinery exploded. Horsepower ratings climbed. Machines grew larger, heavier, more sophisticated. Every major manufacturer, John Deere, International Harvester, Case, Massey Ferguson, and Allis-Chalmers, posted record profits. In 1977, Allis-Chalmers' annual profits hit $58.7 million. On the factory floor at West Allis, the boom was visible. The parking lots filled. Overtime shifts ran 6 days a week. The cafeteria stayed open past midnight. A generation of Milwaukee families, second-generation and third-generation Allis-Chalmers workers, children and grandchildren of the men who had built the Hoover Dam turbines and the Manhattan Project machinery, settled into what looked like permanent prosperity. But inside the corporate headquarters, the executives were seeing numbers that did not match the boom. The power generation division was struggling against GE and Westinghouse. The electrical products business was losing money year after year, squeezed by rising copper costs and foreign competition. In 1978, Allis-Chalmers entered a joint venture with Siemens of Germany, forming Siemens-Allis, an admission, essentially, that the company could no longer compete in electrical distribution without a partner. The Fiat-Allis joint venture in construction equipment, formed years earlier with the Italian automaker, was already a source of management conflict. The two parent companies disagreed on product strategy, on pricing, on international markets. Decisions took months. Dealers complained, and underneath all of it, a quieter crisis was building. The company's pension plans were underfunded. Allis-Chalmers employed 40 separate pension funds for its various divisions and subsidiaries, a legacy of decades of acquisitions and mergers. Each had its own rules, its own investment assumptions, its own funding requirements. By the late 1970s, the combined unfunded liability was climbing toward $200 million. Management knew it. The auditors knew it. The union trustees knew it. No one had a plan to fix it. On the factory floor, workers felt something changing. The overtime was still there. The paychecks were still there. But the new hires were fewer. The capital improvements were fewer. The talk in the lunchrooms shifted. Someone's uncle had taken early retirement. Someone's brother had been laid off from a division nobody had heard of. A line supervisor's job had been eliminated and not refilled. The men and women of West Allis had lived through the Great Strike of 1946 and 1947, some of them personally, most through the stories handed down from their fathers. They knew what the company was capable of. They watched and they listened and they waited. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the monetary policy of the United States was about to change in a way that would transform every calculation Allis-Chalmers had ever made. In August of 1979, President Jimmy Carter appointed Paul Volcker as chairman of the Federal Reserve. Volcker arrived at the Fed with a single mandate: crush inflation. The consumer price index was running above 11%. Interest rates would have to rise and keep rising until inflation broke. Over the next year and a half, Volcker pushed interest rates to heights no American businessman had ever seen. On December 19, 1980, the prime lending rate hit 21.5%, the highest in the recorded history of the United States. The federal funds rate climbed toward 20%. Mortgage rates exceeded 18%. For American farmers who had borrowed to expand through the 1970s, the consequences would be catastrophic. For the companies that had sold them tractors, combines, plows, and implements, the consequences would be nearly as bad. For Allis-Chalmers, the corporation that had been second best in every market it served, the consequences were about to be unsurvivable. The 1980s farm crisis did not announce itself. It arrived the way a thunderstorm arrives on the Great Plains: a shift in the air, a darkening of the sky, and then, all at once, everything breaking apart. For a decade, American farmers had done exactly what Washington had told them to do. They had planted fence row to fence row. They had gotten big. They had borrowed against their land to buy more land, and borrowed against the new land to buy bigger tractors, and borrowed against the tractors to plant more acres. Through most of the 1970s, it had worked. Grain prices were high. The Soviets kept buying. The banks kept lending. Then, three things happened at once. In January of 1980, President Jimmy Carter imposed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union in response to its invasion of Afghanistan. American farm exports collapsed overnight. The buyer who had absorbed much of the nation's surplus wheat and corn since 1972 was gone. In late 1980, the prime lending rate hit 21.5%, and the Federal Reserve held it at crippling levels into 1981. Every farmer with a variable rate mortgage, a variable rate equipment loan, or a variable rate operating line suddenly owed more than he could pay. Land values, which had doubled and tripled through the 1970s, began to fall. A farmer who had borrowed against a $1,000 an acre farm watched his collateral drop to $600, then $500, then $400. And in the fields, commodity prices kept falling. Corn, wheat, soybeans, too much supply, not enough buyers. By 1984, the Federal Reserve Board estimated that 1/3 of all American farmers held nearly 2/3 of the nation's total farm debt. Farm foreclosures accelerated. Suicides climbed. Small towns across Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Wisconsin emptied out. Main Street implement dealers that had been in business for 3 generations closed their doors. In 1985, Willie Nelson, John Mellencamp, and Neil Young staged the first Farm Aid concert in Champaign, Illinois, trying to raise money and attention for families being pushed off land their grandfathers had homesteaded. Allis-Chalmers was caught directly in the path of the storm. In 1981, the company posted a loss of $28.8 million, its first significant loss in modern memory. A bad year, executives told shareholders. A temporary adjustment. The farm economy would recover. It did not recover. In 1982, Allis-Chalmers lost more than $200 million. It was a staggering number. It was larger than most of the company's annual profits from the booming 1970s. It represented more than 20% of the company's entire equity. Every division was bleeding. Agriculture was bleeding worst of all. But mining equipment was also collapsing, as metal prices fell and copper mines across the American West suspended operations. Construction equipment was bleeding as highway projects dried up. Power generation was bleeding as utilities canceled nuclear plant orders in the aftermath of 3 Mile Island. All of their businesses were highly cyclical, and they all turned down together back in 1982. one industry analyst observed later. That was the fatal sentence. Allis-Chalmers' diversification, long advertised as a strength, had become its catastrophic weakness. The company had nothing to lean on. Every leg of the stool was collapsing at once. In 1983, the losses continued. More than $130 million that year. Management began to sell. The first to go was Simplicity Manufacturing, the lawn and garden equipment division. In 1983, Allis-Chalmers sold Simplicity to its own management team in a leveraged buyout. It was a small division. The sale barely moved the numbers, but it was a sign, a public, visible sign, that the empire was shrinking. In 1984, the losses ran to $103 million. 4 consecutive years of red ink. Nearly $500 million in cumulative losses. The board of directors met in emergency session after emergency session. Outside advisors were brought in. Restructuring consultants walked the halls of corporate headquarters with grim faces and thick binders. Inside the West Allis plant, the mood had shifted from worry to dread. Layoffs had already begun in smaller waves. A line here, a shift there. A division quietly shuttered in Pennsylvania, another in Ohio. Men who had worked at West Allis for 25, 30, 35 years began to see the writing on the wall. The pension rumors intensified. Everyone knew the funds were underwater. Everyone wondered if the retirement they had been promised would actually be there when they needed it. At the Union Hall, old-timers remembered the 1946 strike. Their grandfathers had walked those picket lines. Their fathers had told them the stories. Now those old men, some of them in their 70s and 80s, watched their grandsons come home from shifts that grew shorter every month. Then came the decision no one wanted to make. By late 1984 and into early 1985, the Allis-Chalmers board understood that the agricultural division, the business that Harry Merritt had rebuilt, the business that Otto Falk had bet the company on, the business that had once generated nearly 60% of corporate revenue, the business wrapped in Persian orange and running through the imagination of every farm child in America, could not be saved. It had to be sold. The executives began quiet conversations with potential buyers. American farm equipment companies were no longer interested. They were in the same crisis. But one foreign company expressed interest. A German company. An old one. Older even than Allis-Chalmers itself. And on a cold day in 1985, the last Persian orange tractor rolled off the assembly line at West Allis. A worker taped a sign to its hood. That's all, folks. The end. The German company was called Kluckner Humboldt Deutz AG. It was based in Cologne. Its engine-making roots stretched back more than a century, to the 1870s, when Nicholas Otto had built the first commercially successful 4-stroke internal combustion engine in a workshop that would eventually become part of Deutz. The company already owned Deutz-Fahr, a respected European farm equipment brand. It was looking to enter the American market. Allis-Chalmers was looking to leave it. The negotiations moved through the first half of 1985. In the boardrooms of Milwaukee and Cologne, the lawyers and accountants worked through the terms. Allis-Chalmers would sell its entire agricultural equipment business, the dealer network, the assembly line at West Allis, the Allis-Chalmers Credit Corporation, the tooling, the inventory, the brand. The purchase price was $107 million. The book value of what was being sold was $260 million. Allis-Chalmers was taking a $153 million loss on the transaction. But the company had no choice. The agricultural business was hemorrhaging cash. Another year of it might sink the entire corporation. Better to sell at a devastating loss than to sink the whole ship trying to save one division. The sale closed. Kluckner Humboldt Deutz renamed the business Deutz Allis. It agreed to continue producing Allis-Chalmers tractors at West Allis through the end of 1985 under the new brand. But the Persian orange was not in Deutz's plans. The new owners would switch to spring green, a color more familiar to European markets, and would eventually shift most production to other facilities. In December of 1985, the last Allis-Chalmers tractor ever built rolled down the assembly line at West Allis. A worker, his name is not recorded in any corporate document, reached up with a piece of tape and a hand-lettered sign. "That's all, folks. The end." Then he stepped back and watched the machine roll away. Many of the workers who stood on that line that day did not learn officially that they were losing their jobs. They learned at a tractor pull. It had been announced at a public agricultural event in the Midwest, in front of farmers and dealers, before management had held a formal meeting with the employees at West Allis. By the time the company's communications department sent out the letters and convened the town halls, the news had already spread through the union halls, the taverns along National Avenue, the Lutheran and Catholic parish basements where the workers' families had gathered for 3 generations. They had built the tractors that fed America. They found out they were done at a tractor pull. The same year, 2 other major Allis-Chalmers businesses disappeared. In November of 1985, the company sold its remaining minority stake in the Fiat Allis joint venture to its Italian partner. Fiat renamed the business Fiatalis. Allis-Chalmers was out of construction equipment for good. Also, in 1985, the company announced the termination of 11 of its 40 pension plans. The affected workers numbered roughly 6,800, current employees and retirees. The unfunded liability of the terminated plans would be handed to the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, the federal agency created in 1974 to backstop exactly this kind of collapse. Many of the retirees receiving those notices had worked at Allis-Chalmers for 30, 40, 45 years. They had built the Hoover Dam turbines. They had machined the uranium processing equipment of the Manhattan Project. They had walked the picket lines of 1946. They had given their entire working lives to one company. Now the pensions they had been promised were being reduced, delayed, renegotiated, and in some cases cut by half. The selling continued through 1986. Division after division, plant after plant. The company shrank on a schedule, but it was not enough. By the spring of 1987, the cash flow situation had become impossible. The company's U.S. cash flow had run negative $24 million in 1986 and negative $2 million again in the first quarter of 1987. Debt service was overwhelming revenue. Creditors were losing patience. The pension obligations, even after the terminations, remained enormous. On March 4, 1987, Allis-Chalmers presented a restructuring plan to its shareholders, lenders, and workers. The plan called for selling off every remaining business except American Air Filter, a Louisville, Kentucky subsidiary that had contributed $303 million of the company's $771 million in 1986 revenue. The plan called for raising $100 million in new public financing. It called for deferring payment of more than $255 million in long-term and short-term debt. It called for cutting health benefits for current and retired workers. The plan went nowhere. On Monday, June 29, 1987, Allis-Chalmers Corporation filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection in the federal court for the Southern District of New York. The chairman, Wendell F. Buch, called it the only practical alternative. On the New York Stock Exchange that day, Allis-Chalmers stock fell 50 cents to close at $2.25 a share. The company that had once out-earned IBM was now worth less per share than a hamburger. In West Allis, the impact was already visible. 10,000 workers had once filled the plant. Now just 480 remained. In October of 1987, the bankruptcy court approved the sale of the Allis-Chalmers pump division to ITT Corporation for $71 million. The sale closed in November, another major business, gone. On October 31st, 1988, the bankruptcy court approved the company's plan of reorganization. On December 2nd, after shareholder and creditor votes, the bankruptcy proceedings were formally consummated. The old Allis-Chalmers stock was canceled. New stock was issued. The board of directors was replaced with representatives of the trusts created by the bankruptcy. When the new stock began trading, it was valued at 61 cents per share. The shareholders who had held the old stock, many of them retirees, many of them current and former Allis-Chalmers employees who had bought the company's shares through payroll deduction over decades, were wiped out. Their investment in the company they had worked for was worth, effectively, nothing. On January 29, 1989, the Allis-Chalmers factory at West Allis officially shut down, except for a small administrative staff. The sprawling plant where an entire American city had been named, where Harry Ehrig had built the world's first fuel cell vehicle, where the equipment for the first atomic bomb had been machined, where 11 months of strikers had stood on picket lines in the snow of 1946 and 1947, where the Persian orange tractors had rolled out by the hundreds of thousands into the farms of the American heartland. All of it finished. But the company itself was not yet dead. A small office remained open in Milwaukee. A skeleton staff kept the name alive, processed final paperwork, answered the last trickle of customer inquiries. For 10 more years, the sign on the door would still say Allis-Chalmers. Until one morning in January of 1999, when a man would walk up those steps, unlock the door for the last time, turn off the lights, and end 152 years of American industrial history. The morning of January 30th, 1999, was cold. Milwaukee in late January is a specific kind of cold, a dry, lake-carried wind off Lake Michigan that pushes down the streets of the old industrial neighborhoods and rattles the glass in office windows. It was a Saturday. The sky was gray. Patches of hard-packed snow lay along the sidewalks. There was almost no traffic. The last office of the Allis-Chalmers Corporation occupied a modest suite in a building in downtown Milwaukee. Not the old corporate headquarters. That had been closed years earlier. Not the West Allis plant. That had been shuttered a decade before, in January of 1989. This was the final administrative remnant. A handful of desks, a row of filing cabinets, a telephone that still rang, occasionally, when a farmer somewhere in Iowa or Nebraska or Kansas called looking for a replacement part for a Persian orange tractor his grandfather had bought in 1958. On that Saturday morning, someone walked up the steps, unlocked the door for the last time, stepped inside, and began packing away the final files. When he left, the name on the door came down. It had been on that door, or a door like it, in Milwaukee, for 152 years. 152 years since 1847, when James Seville and Charles Decker had opened the Reliance Works on West Water Street, a small Milwaukee machine shop that built milling equipment for sawmills and flour mills. 138 years since Edward P. Allis had walked into a sheriff's auction and bought the bankrupt foundry. 98 years since the merger of 1901 had created Allis-Chalmers and given Milwaukee an industrial giant to rival any in America. 97 years since the city of West Allis had been named after the plant on its western edge. 83 years since General Otto Falk had taken command of a bankrupt company and bet its survival on tractors. 73 years since Harry Merritt had arrived from Holt and chosen Persian orange. 58 years since Pearl Harbor and the beginning of the war work that had helped defeat fascism in Europe and the Pacific. 54 years since the Manhattan Project had shipped its last crate of uranium processing machinery from the West Allis loading docks. 53 years since the morning of April 29, 1946, when 8,000 local 248 workers had walked off the job and begun the longest strike of the post-war era. 46 years since the WD-45 had redefined the American farm tractor. 40 years since Harry Ehrig had driven the world's first fuel cell vehicle across an Allis-Chalmers demonstration field. 14 years since the last Persian orange tractor had rolled off the line with a hand-lettered sign taped to its hood. 12 years since the Chapter 11 filing. 10 years since the West Allis plant had finally locked its gates. All of it ending on a quiet Saturday morning in Milwaukee with the click of a key in a lock. There was no ceremony, no press release, no photograph in the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. The last employees of the company, the skeleton crew of clerks and service representatives, had known the date was coming. They cleared their desks. They carried out the last boxes. They shook hands in the hallway. They went home. The letters kept coming for months afterward. Farmers from across the country, elderly men, mostly, the last generation to have bought Allis-Chalmers equipment new, wrote to the company asking for parts, for service manuals, for the address of a dealer who might still carry an injector pump or a hydraulic seal for a 1960s tractor still running on a farm in Kansas or Minnesota. The letters arrived at an office that no longer had anyone to answer them. They were forwarded. They were returned. Eventually, they stopped. The name Allis-Chalmers was no longer a company. It was now, and would remain, a memory. The pieces scattered in every direction. The agricultural business, sold to Kluckner-Humboldt-Deutz in 1985 and renamed Deutz Allis, went through one more transformation. In 1990, a group of Deutz Allis managers led a buyout of the North American operations. They reorganized the business as the Allis Gleaner Corporation, AGCO, headquartered in Duluth, Georgia. Over the following decades, AGCO grew by acquiring other fallen American farm brands: Massey Ferguson, White, New Idea, Heston, Challenger. Today, AGCO sells tractors in more than 140 countries. In some of its product lines, the old Allis-Chalmers engineering DNA still lives. The Persian orange itself was gone. The remaining service businesses were consolidated into Allis-Chalmers Energy, headquartered in Houston, Texas, serving the oil and gas industry with pumps and compressors. Distant descendants of the Dixon manufacturing line absorbed in the 1901 merger. In August of 2008, Briggs & Stratton announced it would license the Allis-Chalmers name for a line of lawn and garden tractors. Persian orange returned, in miniature form, to suburban yards across America. A brand memory, revived as a consumer nostalgia product. The West Allis Works itself had been dismantled over the course of the 1990s. Most of the factory buildings were razed. The Great Forge Shop east of the intersection of Washington Street and 71st Street, where 53-ton flywheels had been hammered into shape, where the uranium processing equipment for the Manhattan Project had been machined, became a parking lot. Some surviving buildings were converted into retail space. Others were handed over to the Milwaukee Area Technical College, which used them for industrial trades training. Above one of those converted retail stores, an old Harnisch-Fager crane still hangs, built by Allis-Chalmers' Milwaukee neighbor, used for decades inside the plant, left in place as a quiet monument to the scale of the work that had once been done there. In Washington, D.C., at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, Harry Ehrig's 1959 fuel cell tractor still sits on display. Children walking past it rarely pause. There is no sign explaining that it was built in a plant that no longer exists, by a company that no longer exists. 4 decades before the technology it pioneered would be taken seriously by the rest of the automotive industry. The three men whose lives shaped the story did not live to see the final day. General Otto Hermann Falk had died in April of 1940, before Pearl Harbor, before the Manhattan Project, before Persian orange became a national symbol, before the strike that broke the Union he had never dealt with. He died believing the empire he had rebuilt was permanent. Harold Robert Christoffel had died in 1991, 8 years before the final office closed. He had served his prison sentence for perjury in the 1950s. He had rebuilt a quiet life outside the union movement that had once been the center of his world. He had lived to see the plant where he had led 10,000 workers on strike reduced to bulldozed fields. The workers of West Allis, the men and women who had built the Hoover Dam turbines and the Manhattan Project uranium machinery, who had walked the 11-month picket line, who had assembled the Persian orange tractors that fed America, scattered too. Some took jobs at Harley-Davidson, Briggs and Stratton, or the Milwaukee breweries. Some moved south to the non-union factories of Texas and Tennessee. Some retired on pensions that had been cut and restructured in bankruptcy court, receiving less than they had been promised. Many simply grew old in the neighborhoods around the empty plant, walking their dogs past the bulldozed lots, remembering. Allis-Chalmers had once been a company built on 4 powers: steam to drive the engines of an industrializing America, gas to replace the horse on the American farm, water to turn the turbines of the dams that lit the West, electricity to carry the current that ran the factories and cities of the 20th century. By the morning of January 30th, 1999, there were no powers left. Only a lock, a door, a silent office, and the memory of a Milwaukee giant that had helped build the American century and had not survived it.